ancient land. In short, so far as Palestine is concerned, the powers have made no statement of fact, which is not admittedly wrong, and no declaration of policy, which at least in the letter, they have not always intended to violate. And that's it. The British never intended the Balfour Declaration to be a concrete legal document, nor did they intend the Hussein-McMahon correspondence to be a concrete legal document. And at the end of the day, the French didn't get everything they were promised in the Sykes-Picot Treaty, but they did get a colonial mandate over Syria and Lebanon, and the British got a colonial mandate over Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. Thank you.
So I'd like to give the other panelists an opportunity for brief comments. Up to 5 minutes.
I have one thing to ask Joel. In preparation for this, I was interested and did a bunch of reading, particularly since it's been so much in the online lately about the Balfour Declaration. And one of the things about it that's maintained is that part of what was going on was the British concern that the Americans would stay neutral in the war, and they really wanted them to come in, and that part of the goal of the Balfour Declaration was to appeal to U.S. Jewry, which they considered to have all sorts of power, perhaps more than it actually had, to prevail upon its government to bring the U.S. into the war. Do you think that was an important factor also?
Yes, not only did the British involved in issuing the Declaration think that American Jewry could do them some good in the war, they thought the same as well for German and Russian Jewry. German Jews were very patriotic, participated in the German military disproportionate to their numbers in the population, won medals of valor disproportionate to their numbers in the population. So the British were thinking, oh, well, the Germans, we hear, might issue a similar declaration, so we better beat them to the punch so that we can undermine the patriotism of German Jews. And they also thought that they could keep Russia in the war by issuing the Balfour Declaration, because the Jews would want Russian Jews would want Russia to stay in the war rather than pull out, which they did after the Bolshevik Revolution. That was incredibly ridiculous because the Russian socialist Jews were anti-Zionist, whether they were Bolsheviks or Mensheviks or Bundists or what have you. All of this imagination of the power of international Jewry, of course, smacks of anti-Semitism. So Edmund Montague was absolutely right that the Balfour Declaration is an anti-Semitic document.
Okay, other comments from panelists before we move on? Okay, hearing none. I would like to introduce Basma Fahoum. Basma Fahoum is a PhD student of the modern Middle East at Stanford University. She holds an MA in cultural research from Tel Aviv University. She is currently working on the history of tobacco cultivation in Palestine in the late Ottoman and British mandatory periods, as well as in Israel.
So it's very difficult to try and discuss the 1948 war and the Nakba in 10 minutes. So we'll just try my best to illuminate certain points that have to do with this subject. Also, because of the shortness of time, we can't also elaborate more on the things that took place between the Balfour Declaration and 47. So there are 20 years that we're here not accounting for, and I would love to, get questions about that. I think all of us would in the Q&A section, because that also illuminates many of the things that helped or led to the actual outcomes of the 48 war. So on November 29th, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted on and approved a partition plan for Palestine that would have given the Jewish state, the Jews at this time constituted of 1/3 of the population in mandatory Palestine, they would have given them 55% of the lands of mandatory Palestine, while the Arab state would have gotten 45% of the land. The Arab Palestinians decided not to accept this plan, and therefore they rejected it. And the day after it was voted on, fights erupted in Palestine. The 1948 war started after this vote and broke out, and there was a breakout of fighting. There was the first phase, which was between November and May, was the civil war phase, in which both Jewish and Palestinians fought against each other inside of the land. And then after that, the Arab-Israeli phase came when the neighboring Arab countries attacked the nascent Israeli state. So at the end of this war, as a result of it, the Israeli state was established on 78% of the land, while at the same time 700,000, even more than 700,000 refugees were expelled from Palestine. Most of them, 60%, went to Gaza and the West Bank, which is 22% of the area of mandatory Palestine, and Omar will discuss that portion later in his remarks. We have to also to remember that 150,000 Palestinians were left inside what became the State of Israel. I'm actually a descendant of these 150,000. The main question that both historians and political activists had been battling with since is how did the thing that is called now the Palestinian refugee problem came into being. And the main contentions here are, was there an explicit order or was there not? So maybe we should focus a little bit on the facts that we now know after decades of research. So there's a very famous claim that the Arab leadership and the Arab military forces called for the Arab citizens to leave, something that now we know is largely untrue. Not only that, but there was an actual policy of driving Palestinians out and flat-out expulsions. There are many specific, very interesting cases about this that scholarship has illuminated this in the last 30 years. One of these cases is Plan D, which came into being in March 1948, and it was a military strategy that was adopted by the Haganah militia in early March and implemented in early 1948, in early April until June, and it resulted in the highest number of refugees in one period. According to the plan, there was a need for securing the future country's border areas and close off expected invasion routes, and to secure the internal lines of communication, which was a guard against the threat of fifth column activity by the country's Arab minority. According to Benny Morris, this plan came out of military considerations and not as a political blueprint. But as a result of it, 200,000 to 300,000 fled between April and June 48. The question here that should be asked is whether for the Palestinian refugees, is there really a difference between political blueprint and military considerations when the outcome is clearly their expulsion and dispossession? There were also two dozen massacres of Palestinians that were perpetrated by pre-state Zionist militias and Israeli forces. The most famous of which was in April 9th and 10th, 1948, in the village of Deir Yassin, where estimated 115 to 125 Palestinians were killed by Lehi and Irgun soldiers. after this massacre, 50,000 Palestinians fled within 3 days, and then in the next couple of weeks, 30,000. So there's a question here about whether there's a political program, whether there's an explicit order, or whether there's a psychological war, basically, that was going on, and whether that was a part of the way in which 700,000 Palestinians became refugees after the war. There's a very popular, or at least there was a very popular claim, actually it's still used now in Israeli media, where Zionist politicians say, you know, Palestinians, okay, they're Palestinians, but they're also Arabs, and Arabs can live in any of the 22 Arab countries to which they can, you know, go and live there. And that is a very dangerous claim, in my opinion, because it disregards the ties between people and their ancestral land and their right that comes out of that. However, this is only one part of the Zionist narrative that ruled supreme after, in the first decades of after the 48 war. It's funny because the main doctor of the first plans to create this Zionist narrative was Yosef Weitz, who was one of the heads of the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. And he promoted a narrative in which the Exodus was actually a war tactic promoted by the Arabs. I'm not exactly sure how that makes sense, but that's what he said. Zionist and Israeli state officials began to consolidate an official discourse that enabled most Israeli Jews to forget what they had once known. There were many novels that people wrote in Hebrew in which they said what they saw and witnessed and done as parts of the Zionist militias and later the IDF as IDF soldiers. But all of these narratives were completely forgotten, and there were many reasons to be questions to be asked as to why did that happen? How did people who knew that they had Arab neighbors suddenly see their villages depopulated and not ask questions about that? Obviously, there were questions about it, but they were just not answered correctly. There were also laws in the Israeli state that promoted this forgetfulness. For example, the fact that refugees who were internally displaced were declared as present absentees, which allowed the government to confiscate their properties. Of course, this was really important for the nascent Jewish state because they needed these properties to house immigrants, and they needed the cultivable land that was confiscated from Palestinians in order to build their own Jewish economy. This would also explain why refugees who left would not be allowed to return and reclaim their assets. There's also another claim that if the Arabs started the war, then they will have to accept the outcomes of that war that they started. But this also would disregard the long history of settler colonialism in the land and the long and prolonged conflict between the two parts. Yeah, I think I will stop here. And yeah, it's just so complicated that I'm not sure how to explain it in only a couple of minutes. But I would love to hear your questions and actually go into these details of that. Thank you very much.
So I want to give an opportunity again for our panelists to or would you prefer to have just everyone here? Okay.
That's a question that I thought of yesterday. I'd like to hear you think of it. It's often claimed a way of kind of blaming the Palestinians for losing their land and saying, well, the United Nations offered them a state with the partition plan, and they, I'm not sure who that would mean, did not accept it. And I'd like to hear your comments about that particular claim.
It's funny because the League of Nations also offered a mandate for Palestine, which is already in itself a very interesting concept. You know, thinking about nations that's not ready yet to be independent, and they have to be, you know, brought up or put in this kindergarten called a mandate system, so that they will have enough maturity to become independent afterwards. And then when they do become independent, or when imperial calculations tell that Britain that it doesn't want to maintain the system anymore, that it's, you know, causing it too much, then suddenly there's this partition plan that was rejected by the Palestinians because of many different reasons. Some people rejected it because they felt like it was not the United Nations mandate to partition the land in principle. Why partition it? You're like, who gave you the right to do so? That was one opposition. And the other was that the partition was unfair because, as I said before, 2/3 of the population were Palestinian, and they were given 45%. It also is worthy to note that the better land were also included within the borders of what would have become the Jewish state. So many people also objected on, even if they accepted the pragmatic purview of, okay, we'll do with the partition plan, we can accept it, but this is unfair. They rejected it, and that is still being held against all Palestinians as the cause of all of this war, which is a very short-term way to look at the conflict in general, which started much earlier than that, as we all know.
Maybe just add one thing to the point that Vespa makes. With respect, as I think you correctly point out, there were two sets of reasons about why Palestinians objected to the 1947 partition plan. One about how much land was given to each side, and the other being whether partition as a general matter was a good idea. And it bears remembering that at that juncture, there were other ideas in play. The idea that the United States initially supported was in fact not partition, but an approach that would say, let's, as we see elsewhere in the world, go with majority rule. Let's have a democratic framework in Palestine with protections implemented to ensure that minorities would not be subjected to discrimination or persecution, but sort of fulfilling the idea that at the end of the day, democracy means that those who are the majority, except with respect to certain safeguards, would guide the future of the territory.
Yeah, and it's also worth to note that this was the time of partition plans, whether it's in India, Pakistan, or Northern Ireland, and so on. This seemed to be the time when the British pursued it the hardest, and we can look at its results in other places as well and see whether it was effective or not.
It's also interesting to note that there were the Jews who were part of the indigenous population in Palestine before the Zionist movement. There was, I don't think it's possible to know how representative it was, but there was a distinct group of them who, even as far back as the Balfour Declaration, which Joel talked about, came out in opposition to it and said, no, we don't want this to be. They objected to the Zionist plan for a Jewish state and said we wanted to live together with the other indigenous people who were here. And in 1947 and the years immediately before that, even within the Zionist movement, there was a small minority that opposed the idea of partition and favored some kind of a binational state where there would be something like what Omar was saying, a majority rule, but with clear safeguards for both national groups, but a shared country as opposed to a partitioned country. And they became quickly irrelevant and pretty much disappeared once the state was declared and the war started. But there were other voices on the Jewish side as well.
Okay, any further comments before we move on?
We should, I think, with respect to everyone, we're going to have a whole second half in which there will be audience participation. I worry that we'll open up floodgates if we do it at this juncture.
Okay, so I would like to introduce David Mendel of Sacramento Jewish Voice for Peace. David L. Mendel grew up in the Chicago area and lived in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem from 1974 to 1985, working as an editor at New Outlook Monthly and the Jerusalem Post. While reporting for various progressive and some mainstream outlets, he graduated from Hebrew University Law School and was involved throughout that period in movements against the occupation and for peace and equality. In Sacramento, since then, he spent 9 years as an editor at the Sacramento Bee, and then 17 as manager of a legal aid program for California seniors. He's currently involved nationally and with the Sacramento area chapters of Jewish Voice for Peace and the National Lawyers Guild. He volunteers with Palestine Legal to defend faculty and students under fire for engaging in support of Palestinian rights on campus, and led the fight last year against state anti-boycott legislation. In recent years, he's also become involved with the progressive wing of the California Democratic Party as an officer with a local club and an elected delegate to the state and central committee. He led a successful effort to pass a resolution against the occupation and supporting Palestinian human rights at this year's convention.
Thanks. Thank everybody for coming. We've been a little bit ahead of schedule, so I'm going to try to get through a whole lot of notes here, and some we can save for later, but maybe there will be time. The set of maps that you saw that was on the flyer for this event, the second one from the left, by the way, is the partition plan that Basma was talking about, so you can get a conception of it. And the third, the one to its right, is the borders at the end of the 1948-49 war, the truce, the ceasefire, and that all those yellow areas were then part of what was conquered by Israel in 1967. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 67 war, but I have to kind of talk somewhat about what was before it and even bring it a little bit up to the present as well. So as you'll see, the outcome and the aftermath of the 67 war was quite different from what happened in 1948 when Israel took over the whole land, made it part of Israel, removed most of the Palestinian population, and incorporated Israel. But there are also some similarities that point toward the same overriding goal, which is, I think, I don't know if it was stated by either of the first two speakers, but a constant feature in the whole development of the Zionist movement, and particularly after the state was created, was to try to create a state that would have as much land as possible and as large of a Jewish majority as possible, to minimize